Elias Mossialos is Brian Abel-Smith Professor of Health Economics. Welcome. Could you say a few words about how you view the current situation with the pharmaceutical industry? What are the key problems that have to be fixed?
Yeah, we're faced with two types of failures, an industry failure and a government failure. And the industry failure has two variables to examine. One is whether there is financial crisis, whether they need more money to produce innovative drugs, and whether there is an innovation crisis. Let me start with the first point, the first crisis, because this is often the industry's argument that we need more money in the pharmaceutical markets, we need governments to spend more on pharmaceuticals in order for the big pharma to be incentivized to produce more products. But if you look at the OECD data in terms of pharmaceutical exposure trends over the past 20 years, in constant prices, we're spending now 250% more compared to the early 90s. So we're having much more money in this sector. Many may argue that it is generics rather than original products. I would say that the success of generics is in favor of the big pharmaceutical industry, because still 80% of the profitability in this sector is from the original products rather than the generic products. By spending more on generics, we're releasing funds to pay for more innovative products. So in my opinion, there is no crisis in terms of funding. There is, however, a crisis in terms of innovation, because we're having more and more Me Too products in our markets, and they account for a significant part of the growth of healthcare expenditure. For example, we have 15 beta blockers in our markets. Do we need 16, for example? And this is part of the success of the pharmaceutical industry. It's not to blame the pharmaceutical industry. It's part of the success of the pharmaceutical industry producing more innovative products, but in certain therapeutic markets where they have already reached a therapeutic ceiling. The question is, how can the industry be incentivized to take higher risks, spend more on R&D, get the right regulatory signals, and this is now the question of government failure, because we have multiplicity of government regulations in terms of pricing or reimbursement. We're treating all novel pharmaceutical products in the same way. It doesn't matter whether they're Me Too products or whether they're really breakthroughs, we have the same regulatory system.
How do we give industry those incentives to spend more on R&D? Are there both regulatory measures and also perhaps public stimulatory measures?
Certainly, yes. The regulatory measures is that there will be harder regulation for particular products and softer regulation for other products. That's
so
one
this
thing.
means aligning the incentives inside the R&D of the pharmaceutical industry with the overall public health and population concerns of governments generally.
Correct, yes. And move away from the short-termism that is governing the pharmaceutical market nowadays.
So it's a way of forcing the commercial financial market to take a long-term point of view the way it used to perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, but which is
it's changing now because they're driven by stock market incentives. If you look at the 10 big pharma, only 25% of them have a scientist on their board. And that tells a lot about the preoccupations and the priorities.
Sounds like another regulatory area.
Yes, are there Wall Street companies primarily, or are there life sciences companies? So we now need also to develop risk-sharing agreements between governments and the pharmaceutical industry, particularly to focus on therapeutic areas where there is no significant investment, for example, the area of antibiotics, where there is complete market failure because there are no incentives for companies to develop antibiotics, and then for governments to try to contain the use of antibiotics, therefore not developing an environment and market for companies to thrive. And therefore, here we need to have a public-private action so that governments will support a virtual market, will support R&D in the pharmaceutical sector, and will support the industry to develop these products where necessary. But we can do the same for certain types of cancer or drugs to treat neurodegenerative diseases.
You set out a very challenging agenda. It will be very interesting to see the extent to which governments pick up the challenge you have given them. Thank you very much, Professor Mossialos.
Thank you for the opportunity.